All right, so today we're going deep, really deep into one of literature's most iconic figures, Victor Frankenstein.
Uh,
And we're not just skimming the surface here.
right, right. We're gonna really try to understand like what makes him tick, what's going on in that
What?
brain of his.
Exactly. I mean, why is it that centuries later, Victor Frankenstein's story still feels so relevant?
Totally. And to help us, well, unpack all this, we've got excerpts from study guides, character analyses, all sorts of things.
We're going to use those to sort of map out his journey,
I
right? I
know.
mean, his motivations, his flaws, and how all of that leads to, well, let's face it, a pretty tragic end.
Absolutely. And I think a great place to start is with his ambition. I mean, Victor is consumed by this thirst for knowledge, for power. He talks about wanting to penetrate the secrets of nature, to like banish disease from the human frame, big stuff.
He's not messing around with, like ordinary science. He's aiming for something way bigger,
Uh,
right? But I wonder if it's really just ambition, or is there something um, deeper there? Like, is it a need for control? Maybe even a way to kind of, I don't know, escape the normal limits of life and death.
That's a great point. And it's interesting you say control because, Victor's relationship with knowledge is like all about mastery. He wants to understand life so completely that he can like manipulate it, bend it to his will.
It's like playing God, isn't it?
Yeah,
And that's where we get those Promethean parallels, right?
exactly.
Victor's like Prometheus, stealing fire from the gods. He's overreaching, trying to grab a power that, well, maybe humans weren't meant to have.
And just like Prometheus, he faces the consequences. Remember that line, learn from me, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge. Victor realizes how destructive his ambition has become.
It consumes him,
Yeah.
it isolates him, and yeah, it leads to his downfall. But I wonder, was that always inevitable? I mean, was he destined for tragedy from the start?
Well, it makes you think, right?
Look at his background. I mean, he comes from a wealthy, privileged family.
Right.
He even describes them as like one of the most distinguished in Geneva.
Yeah. And that upbringing, it definitely shapes him. It gives him this sense of, well, superiority. He believes he's destined for great things,
Yeah. Right.
He even says at one point, I could not rank myself with the herd of common projectors. He sees himself as, well, apart, above other people.
That's so interesting because it ties into that whole concept of the romantic genius, right?
Hmm.
That
Yeah.
idea of this passionate, creative individual driven by forces beyond their control.
Right, right.
It's like Victor sees himself as one of those figures almost above the rules that apply to everyone else.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. I think Shelley's using Victor to critique that very idea. She's showing us how that romantic genius idea, if it's not checked by morals, by responsibility, can become really destructive.
It's like she's saying, sure, these individuals might have incredible talents, but they're still human. They can still make terrible mistakes.
Yeah.
And the consequences can be devastating, not just for them, but for, well, everyone around them.
Exactly. And I think that leads us perfectly to our next point, the creature himself. He's not just a monster. He's a complex character who, in many ways, is like a reflection of Victor's own internal struggles and flaws.
It's like looking in a mirror, isn't it?
Hmm.
Victor rejects the creature, horrified by what he's created, but that rejection also kind of mirrors his own feelings of isolation, his inability to connect with others.
And the creature's, his eloquence, his intelligence, it makes us rethink that initial perception of him as purely monstrous. Remember when he reads Paradise Lost? He connects
Yeah.
with Adam, abandoned by his creator. He longs for connection, for understanding.
It's pretty heartbreaking. And then, as the story goes on, the power dynamic between Victor and the creature shifts. The creature starts making demands, threatening Victor and those he loves. It gets really intense.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that line, I saw around me nothing but a dense and frightful darkness, penetrated by no light but the glimmer of two eyes that glared upon me.
It's terrifying, right? The creature becomes this, like, haunting presence, this constant reminder of the consequences of Victor's actions. He's like the embodiment of Victor's guilt and fear.
And that fear drives Victor to make some really, really desperate decisions, which, as we'll see, just lead to more tragedy. He's stuck, like spiraling further and further down.
Yeah, it's like this ripple effect, like his ambition just kind of spreads outward, causing all this destruction. And that really ties into another big theme we see, that tension between science and nature.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Victor's whole quest for knowledge, this desire to create life, it's presented as this like transgression against the natural order.
Mm.
He has at one point penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. Almost like an act of violation, right?
Totally. It's like he's trying to dominate nature, to force it to obey him.
Yeah.
And this was a huge, huge anxiety back in Shelley's time. Think about it. You have all these new scientific discoveries, things like galvanism, blurring the lines between life and death. People were terrified of what might happen.
It's that Pandora's box, right? So
Exactly.
once you unleash these forces, who knows what's going to come out? And for Victor, the consequences are, well, immediate. He loses his brother, his friends, ultimately even Elizabeth.
Yeah, and Elizabeth's interesting, right? Because she represents this kind of purity, this connection to the natural world that Victor has totally lost. Remember how he finds some peace in the Alps?
Right.
He says his grief is kind of subdued and tranquilized by nature's beauty.
But even that peace is fleeting. He
Yeah.
can't escape what he's done, the shadow of his creation.
Yeah.
And that leads to, I think, one of the most pivotal moments in the whole book. Victor's decision to create a female companion for the creature.
Oh, yeah. Things get really complicated here.
So at first he agrees, right?
Mm.
Driven by guilt, maybe even a hope that he can, fix things somehow.
Right.
But then he hesitates. He starts imagining these two creatures reproducing, creating this whole race of beings he can't control. It's like he's finally understanding how much responsibility he has, and the potential for even more chaos.
Yeah, and that's the core of his struggle, isn't it?
Totally.
He feels this sense of responsibility for the creature's suffering, but he's also terrified of unleashing something even worse on the world.
It's a lose-lose situation. So he destroys the female creature. He basically condemns the creature to this eternal loneliness.
And that's when the creature vows revenge. He promises to be with Victor on his wedding night.
It's chilling, right? And that sets in motion all those tragic events that follow. Victor, he's paranoid. He's rushing to marry Elizabeth, hoping to protect her.
Right, but it's too late. The creature strikes. He kills Elizabeth on their wedding night.
Such a brutal act of revenge, fueled by, all the creature's own pain and isolation.
And it's so symbolic, right?
Yeah.
Elizabeth, this innocent, pure figure, is destroyed by the consequences of Victor's actions. It shows how tragedy can spread, touch even those who seem protected from it.
It's like this stark reminder that our choices have consequences, and sometimes those consequences reach far beyond us.
And Victor's world just crumbles. His father dies from grief, and he's left totally alone, consumed by this obsession, to hunt down the creature and destroy him.
It's like he's replaced one kind of ambition with another, only this time it's fueled by vengeance and despair.
And this chase, it takes him to the Arctic, where he meets another character who kind of reflects Victor's own ambition and isolation. Robert Walton.
Right, Walton, the explorer who finds Victor, sick and dying, drifting on the ice. And Walton's drawn to Victor's story, isn't he?
He is.
He sees a kindred spirit, someone who gets that, that allure of the unknown.
But he also sees the terrible cost of that ambition. He sees Victor's pain, his regret, and it forces him to confront his own desires, to really ask himself, is glory worth the potential consequences?
So Walton becomes like a stand-in for us, the readers. We're watching Victor's story unfold, learning from his mistakes, grappling with these huge questions about ambition, responsibility, the limits of what we can know.
And then we reach the end of Victor's journey.
Exhausted, full of regret, he dies, leaving behind, destruction and this haunting question. Was it all worth it? It's a real gut punch, right?
It is.
Makes you think about how easily, ambition can tip over into obsession and the price we pay when we try to push the boundaries of knowledge too far.
Yeah, and that's the heart of the novel, isn't it? Shelley's not just writing a horror story here. She's using Victor Frankenstein to explore these fundamental questions about what it means to be human. Our capacity for creation, but also for destruction.
And what's so interesting is that the story, it doesn't end with Victor's death, right?
Right.
We get that last really poignant glimpse of the creature. He's weeping over Victor's body.
That scene, it gets me every time. You have the creature who, throughout the whole story, he's been portrayed as this monster. And then he shows this genuine remorse, like he realizes how much suffering he's caused, and he's just overwhelmed by grief.
He even kind of takes responsibility in a way, right? He says, I, the miserable and the abandoned, am an abortion, to be spurned at and kicked and trampled on. It's like he's finally facing the consequences of everything.
And in a way, he takes control. He chooses to end his own life, seeking some kind of, redemption, I guess, through death. It's tragic, but there's this, glimmer of hope there, too.
Yeah, it suggests that even after all that suffering, there's still a possibility for self-awareness, for
What?
taking responsibility for your choices.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that big question. Was Victor Frankenstein a villain, or was he a victim of his own creation?
Right, that question that's been haunting readers for like, what, 200 years?
Right.
And I think the answer is, well, he's both.
Yeah.
I mean, he's brilliant, he's compassionate, but he's also reckless,
Yeah.
driven by this dangerous ambition.
He's a product of his time, shaped by those Enlightenment ideas, progress, and scientific discovery. But he's also this timeless figure, someone who embodies, like, all those contradictions that make us human.
And that's what makes Frankenstein so powerful, right?
Mhm.
It doesn't give us easy answers. It doesn't tell us who's good and who's bad. It just makes us confront that darkness within ourselves, makes us think about what our ambitions can lead to, and ultimately what it really means to be human.
And that wraps up our deep dive into Victor Frankenstein.
Hope you found it insightful. Hope it got you thinking.
Yeah.
And as always, we encourage you to revisit the book, explore these themes, really dig in.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep diving deep.